This is section 2.11 for Math 0980. And in this section, we're going to do some simple equation solving. So each of these are equations because they have equals signs in the statements, and that makes them equations. So what we want to do when we're solving an equation is we want to get the variable, which is the letter, so in this case x, we want to get it by itself. So we look at it and we go, well, what's next to the x? So we want it by itself on one side of the equal sign. So we want everything else moved to the other side of the equal sign. So right now, x is subtracting 30. So I can, what we call moving it, I can move it to the other side using what we call inverse operations. In other words, the opposite of subtracting 30 is adding 30. So if I have a minus 30 plus 30, I get 0. X plus 0 is just x. So I will end up with just plain old x on the left side, which is what I intended to do. I wanted to isolate that x, so it would be all by itself. So a negative 30 and a positive 30 equals 0. X plus 0 is x. I can do this, except that I can't do it unless I perform the same operation on the right side, because the equal sign means that it's balanced like a scale. So if I add 30 to the left side of the scale in order to keep it balanced, then I need to add 30 to the right side of the scale. So now I have negative 33 plus 30. If you're struggling with that, you can put it into your calculator and you'll get negative 3. So x equals negative 3 is the solution to this original equation. You can check your work by replacing the x with a negative 3. So you would have negative 3 minus 30, and that would actually equal minus 33. So that solution does work. Okay, so look at number 2. They've changed the letter to n, which is no big deal. It still works the same way. And instead of n subtracting something like the x did, in this case, it adds the 3.8. Again, my goal is to get the letter by itself. So the inverse of adding is subtracting. So if I subtract 3.8 from 3.8, that becomes 0. N plus 0 is just n. So I get my n isolated on the left, but whatever I do on the left side, I have to also do on the right side. So I'm going to subtract 3.8 from the right side, and my answer will be 1.7. So n equals 1.7 is the answer. I could check it by substituting 1.7 in for n, adding it to 3.8, and I should get my 5.5. So in this case, we had subtracted originally, the inverse was adding. Here we had added originally, the inverse was subtracting. So how is this negative 3 related to the variable p? Well, there's not a minus or a plus sign in between them. There's nothing in between them, and that implies multiplication. The inverse of multiplication, or the opposite of multiplying, is dividing. So if I divide by negative 3, anything divided by itself becomes 1. So negative 3 divided by negative 3 is 1. 1 times p is just plain old p. So I've now isolated the p on one side of the equal sign. But remember, what I do on the left side, I have to also do on the right side. So I'm going to divide by 3 on the right side as well. Negative 9 divided by negative 3 gives me positive 3. So my answer is p equals 3. You can check it by replacing p with 3. Negative 3 times 3 is negative 9. All right, so this one was a minus something, a plus something, a times, and this one is a divided by. So the fraction bar means divided. So if I want to do the inverse or the opposite, then I'm going to instead multiply by the 5, because 5 divided by 5, so this 5 is on top because I multiplied it. This one's on bottom. 5 divided by 5 is 1, so that cancels. 1 times y is y. I now have my y isolated. But what did I do? I multiplied by 5, so therefore I must multiply by 5 on this side. So negative 12 times 5 is negative 60. That would be the answer for that equation. I can check it by replacing y with negative 60. Negative 60 divided by 5 is negative 12. So I want to look at number 9 because a lot of people they struggle when there's a fraction in front of the variable and what to do with that. And there are actually two ways of dealing with this. Well, there's more than two, but there are two pretty common ways. So one thing you can think about is the number on top, which in this case is a 2, is connected to the x with multiplication. The number on bottom is divided. So it's like a 2 and 1. It's like combining problem 3 where we multiplied with problem 8 where we divided. So you're doing two things at once. So what you can do is you can deal with one and then the other. So let's say we're going to deal with the divided by 13. The opposite of divide is times. So I would put times 13 and that would cancel, and times 13 on this side to balance it, right? So that becomes 1 times 2 is 2. So I'm left with 2x equals whatever 14 times 13 is. And it is 182. But now I still have another step to go because x is not isolated. So the 2 is connected with multiplication. I would divide so that that cancels, becomes 1 times x, which is x. And I have to do the same thing on the right side. 182 divided by 2 is 91, and that would be the answer. You can check it by substituting 91 for x and doing 2 fraction 13 times 91, and you should get 14. Okay, what's another way of doing it? Well, let's rewrite the equation. So if I had 2/13 x equals 14. So another way I can think of it is this entire fraction 2/13 is being multiplied by the x. So the opposite of multiplying is dividing. So I can divide the whole thing by the entire fraction as long as I divide this by the entire fraction. Anything divided by itself, 2/13 over 2/13 is just 1. 1 times x is x. 14 divided by 2 fraction 13 you can do on your calculator, and you get 91. So this is a little bit quicker, but it's nice to know that you can split it up if needed. And then there is one more method that a lot of people use, and that is if you do these two steps at the same time. So I multiply by 13 and I divide by 2 in the same step. So let's say I had 2/13 x equals 14. So if I'm going to multiply by 13 and then divide by 2 in the same step, right? Then the 13 over 13 cancels, the 2 over 2 cancels. And this, the upside down fraction, is called a reciprocal. And I can certainly do that as long as I do that on the right side as well. So the 13s become 1, the 2's become 1, 1 times x is x. And then 14 times 13 fraction 2 is, of course, 91. So you actually get 3 ways of dealing with that. You know, whichever way you like best, then I recommend you stick with it. All right, so I want to move to problems 12 and 13 because they're story problems, so I just want to help you get them set up. So in problem 12, they talked about the original weight of a macaroni box has been decreased by 8%. And the new weight is 14.4, so what was the original weight? Well, if I decrease the weight by 8%, then that means my new box is only 92% of its original weight, right? So my multiplier is 0.92. So 92% of the original weight, which I don't know, so I'm going to call that x, gives me my new weight, which they told me was 14.4. So 92% of the original weight is the new weight of 14.4. So this is the equation for my numbers. You could plug your numbers in. How would I solve for x? I would divide by 0.92 because it's currently being multiplied. And then I would make sure that I did the same on the right side, divide by 0.92, and you should have your answer. Okay, and then question 13 talks about a swimming pool that's round, and the guy wants to know what the diameter is, which is the distance across, but he doesn't have a tape measure long enough, so somehow he figures out how to measure the circumference. which is a little weird because that's longer than the diameter. So if he didn't have a tape measure for that, how does he have it for that? But maybe he did it in chunks, I don't know. So what you want to use is the formula for circumference of a circle. The circumference of a circle equals pi times the diameter. You're trying to find the diameter, and they give you the circumference. So let's say my circumference was 10. So I would replace the circumference with 10 equals pi times d. I want to solve for d, so I want it by itself. So what would I do? I would divide by pi on both sides. Pi over pi is 1, and I would get d equals whatever this answer ends up being. Okay, now in this case, they do not say to use 3.14 for pi, so I would use the real full up pi on the calculator, depending on which one you have. Like my pi is right there. So I could just go 10 divided by pi equals. So they want the full up pi, 3.1415, blah, 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 blah. And so that pretty much wraps this lecture up. You know, some of your equations are a little more complicated than this, but those are the basic 4 things that you would do. You would add, subtract, divide, or multiply based off what was connecting the numbers to the original variable. All right, talk to you later.